Welcome everyone to our July 14th Cardea Users Group meeting. We're happy to have you all here. Cardea is it belongs to the Linux Foundation Public Health, and we follow the Linux Foundation antitrust policy, which can be found in the meeting notes, as you can see on the screen. Basically, do not discuss pricing or specific business deals in our working group meetings. And we also follow a Cardea Code of Conduct, which is summarized as be nice to everyone and everyone has a voice. If you have a problem with either antitrust, if you feel like an antitrust activity is going on, please immediately raise that issue during the meeting and we will try to address it there. If there is an issue with Code of Conduct behavior, please contact either myself or Keela or the Linux Foundation Public Health folks, and they will help resolve that. Is there anyone who would like to introduce themselves today? I will not give it a full pause because I think everyone here has already introduced themselves. So let's go ahead and get started. Today we're trying to work on what it would take to take the Cardea use case extensions and move those forward if the steering committee is willing to approve that direction. Our use cases are outlined here. The top three here are simple extensions using probably very similar code. The next one down is drug testing, which is a little bit more effort to workplace drug testing to allow that to occur. And so that's a little bit longer, but we'd like to try to put together the action items that would be needed to perform some of these extensions and then select or recommend the top one and see if we can have that effort go forward. So the idea is to put together the proposal for what are the steps required in order to have that happen and what work effort goes with each of those new items. So looking at the list there, we have something like employee health requirements or health certification for university or work, and immunization proofs and TB testing. So if we took the first item on that list and said, if we did, or let's take the simplest one, probably the TB testing one, because that's very, very similar to what we've already got. It's a different use case and a slightly different verifier, a slightly different test in the test results, but very similar to the use case that we're already doing. Mike, do you have some thoughts about what might be required to, what steps would be required to, for instance, to demonstrate TB testing for a healthcare worker working at a nursing facility, for instance?
So let's chat about that workflow just a minute. So the basic idea would be employee needs to show a TB test in order to come to work after a certain amount of period of time, every 90 days or something.
Yep,
I think it's annual, but sure. Or maybe it's every 3 years. Let's just say annual for the purpose of the discussion.
All right, we'll call it annual. So the employee's notified that they're supposed to get a TB test. It's time for their annual TB test. So they go to a lab that offers TB testing and has an issuer. So they get their TB test, and then the lab, gets the results, and then I guess sends them an email that says, hey, we have your results. Scan this QR code to get them on your mobile app. to scan a QR code or follow the link and scan the QR code, I guess would probably be better. It's easier to do that. They scan the QR code, and are we going to do a medical release as part of that process?
Well, I think in theory, if the employee, there's a couple of ways to think about this if we were to just dive into it a little bit more detail. The first is that if the lab is has a connection with their, right, you have to, so with a TB test, in a little more detail, the TB test is where they like put the little bubble of stuff under your forearm, and then you have to go back in a couple of days and they have to see like, did the bubble dissipate or not? Right, that's like the specific TB test. So it's a little bit more of it's not a blood work test. It's a test of observation, I think maybe is the right way to describe it. So you would, as a patient in this, because you're not the employee at the moment, you're a patient who presents to get this TB test, you have established that checkpoint with the lab. So in theory, or the tester, in theory, you could build the connection at that moment with the person who's administering the test, because you need to come back for them to review it also. So that's one point at which they could connect, is at the moment where they say, okay, here, put the stuff under, under my skin. Or I think another theory in that, how that could work, is that the employee authorizes the employer to share the information with the lab, like their who they're going to perform the test on. So when that person presents at the lab, they actually have already received the information, and they've done sort of a hop, skip, and a jump from the employer. I don't know if that causes issues, but I could see either one of those pathways kind of operationally functioning.
So we establish an identity of the patient one way or another.
That's right. Whether the employer introduces it to this flow, or whether the patient, they transition from an employee to a patient on their way to that lab. So the patient that's presenting at that lab could be the initiator of that. I think either one of those works, and it'd be interesting to talk about whether there's pros and cons in handling the result to make sure it gets back to the employer.
So the pathway that requires the least change is the one where, after the test is complete and somehow this connection has been established to the issuer agent, either the lab's automated systems use the API to issue a credential, or the personnel in the lab use the manual issuance form to issue the credential, and that shows up on the patient's phone. And after that shows up on the patient's phone, they could take the credential with them to their employer, who would have a verifier set up. And for the in-person route, they could scan a QR code on either an enterprise or a mobile, so server-based or mobile-based verifier. And that verifier would request their TB test result and give everybody a thumbs up or a thumbs down on whether it was a result they are happy with. For that process, we already have a lab issuer. It wouldn't even need a new schema. It would just, the person filling it out would fill in TB test data. There's already a Cardea mobile agent, so holding the credential would not require any special modifications. And there's already a verifier. We probably would want to use perhaps the government verifier, because it's already set up to handle verifying health credentials and could give people a, clear for employment pass that doesn't specify exactly how they got there. It's just that all the requirements of employment were met. We don't have to use that, trusted traveler type equivalent credential or whatever, but we could if we wanted. And that's the government agent is where the most sophisticated governance interpretation code lives right now. So modifications that we would need, the most substantial one is probably adjusting the governance on the government agent to be aware of TB tests.
Quick question on that. I thought governance and adding and removing DIDs and rules is pretty straightforward. Is it a heavier lift than that? I thought it was.
There are two pieces to the governance, RJ. There's the governance of adding and removing trusted DIDs.
Mm-hmm.
That's really easy. Writing a new presentation definition and business logic to interpret the results requires a little more work. Now, when I say substantial, we're not talking like months. We're talking, if I were to tell Simon, hey Simon, you've written this governance code before, and we need to adjust it to handle a test, a new type of test. That might take us maybe a week or two to make the changes for a new type of test, with different result ranges that we need to look at, or different values, and then to test it to make sure it works. So we're not talking massive effort. It's just the biggest effort to make this adjustment in Cardea.
Okay, I guess so. That's good to know. I was thinking, now I'm following you based on what we did with the COVID test, because there are parameters inside of the credential that were important.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Versus, are we also going to have the scenario that it's dynamic to accept credentials that are issued from a lab or whoever meets the jurisdictional requirements or the governance requirement on the DID for the issuer, that any credentials that they issue would be accepted, and we don't always have to have the ability to dissect schema data to approve it, but it's just dynamic to say this lab issued a flu vaccination or whatever it was, and we don't have to analyze the data inside of it. It's just the governance covers that lab did the right thing, and that would be accepted.
I think that, yeah, I think RJ, what you're saying is, like, do you have to go to the data elements inside the schema to say whether it passes the requirement? I think in the case of lab data, you will probably always need to do that, because a lab result is going to show one test or the other, unless you don't care what the outcome of the test was and you only care that they had the test, the presence of something, then you can skip the data content. In the case of the TB test, they have to be TB negative to be qualifying for work, I believe. We can try to get some clarity on the nuances of the specific TB use cases for a healthcare employee. In that case, you need to know the result of the test, which is a data point inside the schema, meets my criteria to say we are okay here. So there may even be two layers. Did they meet their annual requirement of getting a TB test? In which case you can say the fact that I got a lab schema that is labeled for a TB kind of test, again, knowing that it's labeled for a TB test is a data element inside the schema, because it's a generic lab schema.
You always have to look inside the credential, because the lab result is so broad, you don't know what kind of lab it was. So you're always looking to data elements inside. You may not look deeper than for a vaccination, for instance. You may only look and see that it's a flu vaccination, and that's sufficient. But for things, you're going to look at some data elements to say, what kind of credential is this? So what the type is, it's a lab result, And then you may need to look at the type of the lab inside that says it was a TB test. And then you may need to look at the result field to say it was positive or negative or inconclusive or whatever the results are.
But what I'm wondering is that if the ecosystem requires that it goes to the data element, then you can do it. But like when I use my driver's license, it is up to the verifier, the person looking at it, to say, all right, I need to confirm that it hasn't expired and I need to confirm the address. We don't, I mean, that's a manual process. Do you guys don't envision that as long as the issuer is the correct issuer, the verifier can do the manual verification? This credential is good. All right, are you positive, are you negative? And they could be dynamic and make the determination there.
Oh, you're saying just to present the content that they might need to analyze in as a human on a screen rather than building it into the logic of the code?
Yeah, I just wonder if those are two options, and it depends on the ecosystem what they want.
So RJ, there's verification of the cryptography, making sure the credential is valid and from the right source. And then there's the verification of the data. And those operations can be conducted independently.
So you can bind them in with the machine readable governance to have the whole kit and caboodle done by the code. Or you can say the code just does the cryptography bit and says, here are all the data elements. Mr. Human, you decide. Or, hey, business logic that's not part of the agent itself, some back-end system somewhere else does the evaluation of the data fields to do it. So you don't have to bundle it in with the machine readable governance. You can. That's the most comprehensive way. You can have back-end software look at all the data elements from the credential and make a decision, or you can let the human decide by looking at a screen. And those are all valid methodologies that can be done using the same credential.
Okay, thank you.
As a community, as a Cardea group, we probably ought to decide at which point or which level of those options we're going to default to. What are we going to try and do for the community to say, here's what we provide?
I think that we should explain all three options that they're available. And I think we should default to letting the machine readable governance do most of the heavy lifting, because that makes the use of the system so much easier for the participants.
Yeah, then
you can do it the other way is fine.
The rules are programmatically enforced. I agree. Okay, you said 3. I was thinking there was only 2. What? So
we just does it in machine readable governance. That's one. So the whole thing, cryptographic verification and rule by looking at attributes meets or does not meet the requirements.
Okay.
You do the agent itself just does the cryptographic verification, trusted issuer, that the credential hasn't been tampered with, and then hands off to back-end software somewhere else, the employer's system for analyzing the data, and you can hand the data off and let the back-end system do it. That's number 2. And number 3 is do the cryptographic verification, trusted issuer, not tampered with, and then display the results for a human to interpret.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you, Ken.
Hold on, I didn't quite document all of those correctly. We had, it's managing the cryptographic analysis to unlock the data. If you scroll down a little bit, I'm trying to lay them out in the notes under options. Yep.
Fine.
We have hands off the data, machine readable governance does everything. And there was like a middle one.
So I'm going to retype your notes a little.
Great. Excellent. As long as they get accurately documented, I'm okay with that.
There's cryptographic analysis plus machine readable governance, value analysis is one. Then you have cryptographic analysis plus API handoff, automated systems outside of Cardea.
Oh, okay, got it.
And then you have cryptographic analysis plus
Display.
screen display, human makes a determination.
Understood. Thank you for that clarification.
That's better said than I could do it. So I'm happy you typed that in, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
But that's the idea, is that you have different levels of interaction and you can automate the whole thing. You can have back-end systems that are not part of Cardea automate the whole thing, or you can have human intervention. And for different use cases, it might be appropriate for any one of those three to be selected. So, but that's up to the participants and the ecosystem to decide the rules for how they want to engage and what they're going to do with the data.
And is it possible, just to add one layer of complexity, as we think about how these integrate with existing systems that manage this kind of thing, it could also be possible that you have a hybrid where you have the cryptographic analysis and the machine readable governance and an API to hand off the details for the purposes of record keeping.
Yes.
Or at least giving the thumbs up or the thumbs down to the back end to the other system. So yeah, there's likely to be a back end integration with all of these methodologies. So they typically don't stand 100% on their own, replacing all existing mechanisms that are currently in place. It usually will tie in somehow to the existing systems.
Right, because in as you sort of, for those who may have less exposure to this, there are what are called provider credentialing systems that help healthcare employers manage the smorgasbord of things that have to be in place to have a person in a clinical person in good standing at their facility. And they do that with each health plan, and they have to manage that, and they have systems in place. So this would then probably tap into those systems to say they've met the criteria, and by the way, it's negative. So they're not only did they meet their annual testing requirement, but they're eligible to work on the floor with patients, for example, which was going to the point, RJ, that they're like, yeah, you may have different levels of, sure, they got the TB test, cool. And by the way, what was the result?
Yep. So another thing just came to mind, the API. So when we talk about connecting to third-party systems, is that through the APIs with the enterprise agent, or does the governance package have APIs as well? So you're connecting to both?
The governance code has the option to, during a workflow, to trigger an API call that goes out of the system.
Okay.
We have a little bit less sophistication in the governance so far for receiving and responding to an incoming API call. That ends up being a little more custom at the moment. It's not quite as scriptable as the outbound calls are.
And what are your thoughts on can you give a description on the APIs for the enterprise agent as well? Are they both, how would you describe those?
So there's code that exists where if you go through the workflow, you can trigger a variety of different action types. Most of them have to do with DIDCOM messages between agents at the moment, but there is, we haven't actually written an example of one yet, and we haven't needed it yet, but there is an action type that we laid the groundwork for. That's an API action, where during the workflow, the machine readable governance will kick off an API call based on the instructions found in the script, in the workflow steps that are described in the governance file. So the governance interpreter would look at the API action and say, what is the endpoint? What is the method? What is the body? And those values can be determined in the governance file or fetched from other steps in the process, such as you've presented a credential, and now we're going to take what was in that presentation and we're going to send it to this particular endpoint, so that you could call outwards. Your governance script could call out to an external system that you determine by changing your governance file.
Okay, thank you.
And just to extend that further, in theory, that API action we're saying is could then also like forward something to someone.
Yes,
Yeah.
it has the endpoint is where it's going. The method is
Post or get.
post, get, that sort of thing. And then the body is the contents of what would be sent.
So is that how we would anticipate, and I know we're getting into slightly more nuanced details of the workflow, but the reality of what things are going to look like out in the wild is that because if we're issuing the TB test result to the patient employee themselves, they have to get that to their employer. And that could maybe be handled in one of two ways. They could go they could scan the stuff to their employer, or potentially they could call something that says, and now yes, cool, forward it along. Would that be through the machine readable governance, or do we think they'd have to do a scan of a QR somewhere in that process?
If you leave it as scan a QR and not have automated forwarding of the data, then that allows for the consent of sharing the data with the employer to take place. You could create a more complicated consent workflow that pre-consents to the sharing of the data, but that would be extra work.
Or that they already, somehow they've already established that, and they say, I just received my credential. Like, are you okay with us forwarding this, with this getting forwarded along? Yes, because it was sort of requested by the employer or paid for by, in some cases, these employers. So
the ideal situation, Keela, is that the governance file would specify in the workflow instructions for the holder agent on what to do. So you've received your credential. So now you, as a holder agent, the holder agent should follow this invitation, which would connect them to the employer, and should present this credential. And the holder would say, okay, I know how to do that, and I'm going to ask the user, the patient, for consent to take those steps, so that the systems, the mobile agent would help the user do what they're supposed to do. Or if you wanted to, depending on the customizations you did, you could even, like you said, pre-authorize or make it automatic or something. But to have the holder agent process those steps and allow the user to consent means that it's mostly automated, but you haven't ripped it out of the user's hands to be in control.
Okay. And I think in terms of us just to reel myself back in here, in terms of us talking about sort of easy, we're calling them extensions in this conversation, easy extensions, scanning that QR code to say, now share it with my employer, is certainly the lower lift in terms of us having a ready to go implementation.
I think if we're aiming for a quick extension of what we're working on, then we should rely on that QR code. And then when we have, if we find that lots of people have this need to automate the workflow and Cardea is getting adoption for this use case, then we could later on say, yeah, let's add holder agent scripting to handle this particular workflow that needs to be automated better.
Okay. And I think also learning a little bit more about what is the current flow detail will also help us answer that question, because if the current flow is that they're depending on the employee to take an action, then taking on a slightly less complicated technical action is a good transition. Or if there's some other automation there, then we may need to think about that, because it wouldn't, they would not be happy to say, oh, well, now the person has to take this additional step. So yeah, that will also help us, I think, answer that question.
I think it can start demonstrating that the use case is feasible, and that there probably are optimizations that would make it much more desirable, but it allows for the use cases to get shown. And then the ones that click with people, we can work on enhancing that workflow so that it's more automated, less steps that the user has to manually do, and it just kind of flows better.
Okay, excellent.
Is what, so that kind of gets us through the workflow. And right now we're suggesting that we're going to use the cryptographic analysis and machine readable governance value analysis as the default.
Mhm.
So we're going to default to that method, even though the other two are possible.
Yep.
And I have in our to do, so we had worked through the workflow, we're in sort of answering these questions. In the to do, we said with the adjustment of machine readable governance would be important based on what we just said, Cardea's sort of base model approach will be. And then that would take, let's say we're measuring in weeks, which is why I just put that there. We also should look at actual TB lab results and make sure that it's a happy fit into the lab schema, because the idea was that that schema is universally for labs. TB is a little nuanced because, as I said, it's sort of an observation, a test of observation, and not a blood result, a specific blood result test. So we can do a little cross-referencing there as well. Were there other build tech things that need to happen?
At some point, we may want to consider renaming the government agent, because the governance interpretation and verification and generation of derivative credentials are not always run by a government. And our derivative credential at the moment is called a trusted traveler, but it's not always related to travel.
Is it better to rename that, or to have another a set of credentials that could possibly be issued, such as cleared to work?
I think that we probably want a set of credentials. So I guess rename is not necessarily the right thing to do, but perhaps
Expand on the derivatives.
yeah, we need a additional derivative credential type.
And I think clear to work is also maybe even one term too far, right? This is, as I said, sort of like one of many requirements that they would have to hit. And a lot of those are not, you know, some of those are like, did you graduate from med school? Do you have insurance? So those fall a little bit external to this specific use case.
Just a quick question. So the intent here is that these workflows are built, people can just take the open source code and run with them. And since we're already going to have schema and up there, we probably want to, they're going to reuse that schema, obviously, right? So we want to use a term that's more generic, because we can't be dynamic on naming the term. If it's one of the schema fields, the name.
We could, yeah. I think that's a very good point. That was sort of where I was going to, RJ,
Okay. All right.
which is that like derivative credential, instead of saying cleared to work, maybe it's, you know, TB testing requirement met generically, without having to get into when, you know, who did they get tested by, you know, what exactly were the details of those things. And so you could make that derivative schema name field a thing. What do you think about that, Ken?
Like, you could call it something like health requirements pass, and say one of the fields is the name of the test or tests required, and
Or the specific health requirement. So
right.
so health requirement could be TB test, and you can say that it was how it was met, or what date it was met on, and something like that. And so the health report, you could have 16 of these health requirement met. One of them's for TB testing. One of them was for
Influenza.
your flu immunization. Another one was for you know, whatever other health requirements there were, that you could lift 40 pounds because you're going to be Or helping people get up and stuff, whatever. There might be multiple health requirements that are, some of them are easily fit into the schemas that we're doing now, and some of them that might be more generic, or you can't be an amputee and work in certain situations or whatever. There are multiple health requirements that could be categorized here. Some of them fit into the testing and vaccinations that we've been focusing on so far. And I think we want to still focus on test results and vaccinations for the short term, and then we can expand the types later. But the health requirement met, and then so you could do it with the TB requirement met and have a separate credential for that, or you could focus on health requirement.
If you had a generic health requirement schema that allows you to fill in the fields that describe which requirement you met, then you would only need one schema for
Right.
multiple needs rather than one per need.
Agreed. Okay, so I'm just in a little further down, making some earmarks for future agendas. So we have a technical meeting in 2 weeks from today. Maybe we can dive into laying out that derivative, that new derivative schema.
That's a really good
That's
idea.
a good idea.
Okay, cool.
So in order to demo a new use case, we have listed off here, I think, five different elements: the adjusting the machine readable governance, verifying the lab results of a TB test fit into the result schema, putting together a demo script and actually doing a demo with that. And how about recording a demo? And then renaming the government agent to something more universal, renaming or coming up with a set of one, for this particular use case, I think it would be one additional schema, but using, not messing with trusted traveler, because that is one type of use case. The other one is a more of a, describes each different use case that a health requirement was met, and that might be more universal. When we look at the second one, as we go beyond the TB test, we might determine that, hey, it can share that same type of derivative credential, or maybe not. We'll see as that develops.
And you could almost imagine that once, depending on how good of a job we do with that new the derivative schema, that actually trusted traveler got replaced by that one, right? Which is that the health requirement of traveling has been met, because we've definitely received some feedback that trusted traveler comes with specific connotations in that industry, and it's a little bit confusing.
And it had additional requirements that in the trial that we did with Aruba, it had additional requirements that were outside of healthcare before they issued that trusted traveler.
Exactly.
They took into account the fact that they filled out their embarkation, debarkation card, that they had purchased their health insurance, or they had met their visa requirements or whatever. So there were a bunch of other things that went into the trusted traveler that were beyond the healthcare use case.
So if Cardea is going to focus on medical, then those travel requirements and expanding upon accommodating travel stuff is probably out of scope. And
yeah, no, I'm just saying
where it came from, and we can phase it out.
Right, that this really could be used in that use case, because it's actually maybe more appropriate language to be using, that the health requirement in a package of requirements has been met, whatever that, fill in the blank on whatever it was, or maybe the three things that, you were vaccinated, tested, and boosted, whatever.
The interesting thing about it is that I think that the trusted traveler should still be there. It represents the final conclusion, and it also shows the pulling in of outside requirements that are not healthcare in order to get that. And I think that is still a useful type of thing to show in a more comprehensive workflow. It does highlight the fact that other things besides healthcare stuff are usually involved in some type of a decision. And so taking it to that extra step, it might have been prudent to have issued a healthcare requirement credential all by itself that was then combined with the other requirements to give you also a trusted traveler. So I think that there's some discussion that could happen around that topic as well.
It looks to me like Cardea is going to do well with issuing health credentials. It's going to do well with determining whether the requirements of health were met, and that the different types of derivative credentials that say you've cleared some bar. There are ones where it's strictly medical. There's ones where there are other requirements and it's for travel. There are ones where there are health requirements plus other requirements for employment. And
Right.
those other types of derivative credentials and the workflows that support them, that's something that the Cardea system can support, but those require additional customization. So for our base packages, we're trying to just get the thing up and working for more than one use case. Would be more limited to a derivative that says just health requirements, but there's no reason why, as things go on, we can't have additional derivative types that say we're going to handle checking some of these other things that aren't health, perhaps, or
Right.
at least leaving the system open so that someone can pick up the package and make those customizations for themselves.
Yeah.
It's the concept that you could have a derivative credential that says cleared to work, right? Which would include those other things, like they checked the that they've really got a diploma and that they have malpractice insurance and whatever. And that, again, this TB health requirement is one set that they then use to create that sort of derivative credential from the package. So,
Yeah.
okay, cool.
Would that get us to a demo of a second use case? Or are there other things that would have to happen? We have to stand up a separate demo server, or are we going to go back and modify our existing servers to take this into account? Is the hope that we can combine some of the demos, or do we have to have separate deployments, one for travel, one for TB testing for healthcare workers?
So I believe that our modifications at the moment would allow us to simply say we have an alternate governance file. So we have a governance file set up that supports a travel workflow. We have a governance file set up that supports an atomic action and an independent action testing kind of setup. And we have a governance file that supports a TB testing workflow. Software already includes a governance switcher, so you can select which file you're presently using. And so, that was my hope for the demo, and looking like it's possible to say we can switch on our demo server between workflows and choose what we're demoing on the fly without having to install multiple servers and reconfigure everything.
So it could, if we select a new machine readable governance file, it could actually determine which UI to present. Or do you want to have a UI that presents them all and you just do the one you're going to do?
We've not done a lot of work. It's theoretically possible, but we have not done a lot of work on adapting the UI for entirely different situations based on governance.
I'm okay with not doing that and having all three demos show up, and you just pick which one you're going to use.
There's a bit of code from CETA that we'll have access to that allows us to choose which workflow to kick off. That code could probably read the governance file, and so you could choose a workflow to kick off without having to know which specific buttons to push. So I think we're headed in the adaptable UI direction based on governance, and there may need, but for we're not going to be able to adapt everything. So there may be some level of training that says, based on which governance file you have, if you're using a human mediated step, here's the point at which you would have to do something. Like fill out a form manually for demo purposes or something.
I think there is one other thing that we have brushed over a bit, which is in our Cardea app. How do we know they're looking for TB data? Like, how do we know what they're looking for? They want a TB test result instead of a COVID test result. Before, there was an assumption of COVID test result requesting. And so we also have to think about how is the user, the patient, person, holder, going to clarify to with whom they are connecting, the lab, for example, what they're looking for. Could be through Q&A, or it could be through some expansion of what we've already kind of coded there.
The easiest way at the moment would be to change the workflow in the machine readable governance file to have basic messages that inform the user and Q&A question or questions that would gather some input if necessary. That's probably the most straightforward way. A feature that is on the roadmap, but I don't know when, is there's an updated DIDCOM protocol for presenting proof, and the holder agent could be adapted to interpret what's in the presentation request a little more deeply to help guide the user. But that's that requires a fairly heavy lift on the mobile side, and so is not not going to fit in the couple of weeks that we're aiming to get something done. That would probably be somewhere in the months range, where we'd have to fit it into the longer term roadmap for the mobile team.
The thing that is the longer term, basic Q&A to ask some additional stuff to help guide what it is that the downstream systems know what to do with, like how to receive these instructions. That one is viable.
Yeah, basic Q&A just tells the user kind of, don't pick the one that has your COVID credential in it. I'm looking for TB test, or I'm looking for a flu vaccination. So that helps the user have to use their head to pick which one of the credentials they're going to present. The stuff Mike was talking about looks more deeply into the presentation definition and says to the user, hey, I'm looking through all your credentials and they're asking for a flu vaccination, and I found this one over here. That it takes the user having to sort through their credentials to find the one that's applicable out of, they have 3 vaccination things, one for measles, one for flu, and one for COVID, to know which one to present. And it moves that decision away from them into the computer doing the work for them and saying, I suggest you share this one. They're asking.
It also means that on the query, I'm really concerned for the issuer to know what are they looking to issue, right? In some cases, these could be unsolicited requests. They might have, they might be connecting, let's just say to LabCorp, and they have a long history of test results with that organization, right? So when they receive these demographics and a request for a credential, okay, well, which lab? We could be talking about, thousands of results. We need to be able to direct the issuer to say, but this is what I'm looking for, my latest XYZ kind of thing. I think that we can work through the Q&A, but we do need to think about, as we think about this being totally dynamic, that there's some challenges there. We initially talked a little bit about it in the designing of the medical release credential, but we didn't solve it in this level, at this level of detail.
Yeah. So that's I think a future issue, and we're not going to try to tackle that today or in the next weeks. We're gonna defer that because it's bigger than we can tackle right now. The presentation part of it would be the next one. The issuance one would be the one after that, in my opinion.
Okay.
I'm happy with this outcome. I think that this gives us a clear direction of where we would need to go and what we would need to modify in order to have a second use case demonstrable. I think we could take this to the steering committee and seek their initial approval for this. Other comments or suggestions before we close this part of the discussion? Are there more things to talk about on that?
We did lay out a second one, but I think we should maybe leave that for another day. I do think we laid out what we're going to talk about in 2 weeks, which is a specific new derivative schema, and we can talk through the nuances there. But we should lay out an agenda also for next week, which is a marketing and outreach focus. So I'm not sure if there's anything specific that we want to tackle in that. I know on our team, we've been working in the repos, and there's certainly some areas for improvement there, but also sort of thinking about keeping the barrier of entry for newbies low. How do we keep doing better in that space? So maybe, I don't know if that's appropriate for next week in terms of a marketing and outreach agenda. That's sort of where I was going with how we can spend the last couple of minutes.
Hey, yeah, that sounds great. I think that, yeah, there's lots we could do still, as you said, to keep the barrier for entry low, especially as in this expansion, I'm thinking of even instead of, waiting on kind of an ultimate white paper that's like this long form piece that takes, several months to write, potentially trying to get more like a regular cadence of content produced and populated on the website. And I think, but yeah, there's definitely some steps we can take there.
Okay, excellent. So that can be next week, and then the following week, we'll dive it back into the schemas. And as you mentioned, Ken, this content we've just walked through is plenty ample for us to bring to steering, which I believe has been calendared for us to get a green light, but we can sort of assume that we'll work down this path.
Yeah, I think that if there's some shocking negative feedback from the steering committee, then we can adjust. But I think that this is a highly probable and a short reach. So I think it's something that's safe to kind of start down that path. I think that is the end of that particular topic. Do we have anything else on the agenda for today? Just talking about the futures. That's all I see. Hey,
I think
once we could end the meeting early instead of late. That might be a break of tradition, but maybe a good idea.
I think that makes sense. Okay, well, cool. We've got our next 2 weeks laid out. Very exciting. And a few minutes.
A few minutes back. Thanks everybody for your participation and contributions. We look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.
Bye, all.